A millionaire watched his daughter fade away day by day. Isabella barely had the strength to get out of bed. Then a poor boy, almost invisible to everyone, looked him straight in the eye and revealed the truth that no one dared to say, "Your wife won't let her eat." The man froze, not knowing that those words would change his world forever. Before continuing, be sure to subscribe and leave your like. What you are about to see, you will never forget. The table sparkled under the light of the crystal chandeliers. Red wine glasses lined up like little liquid torches. The cutlery gleamed impeccably, and the aroma of roast meat with fine spices filled the dining room. It was the most important dinner of the week for Julian Herrera. An influential banker, two foreign partners, and a senator had accepted his invitation. Everything had to be perfect, but it wasn't. The elegant silence of the evening was broken by a small, trembling voice, but one filled with hunger. "Can I have seconds, Dad?" The eyes of Isabella, his 7-year-old daughter, stared at the empty plate in front of her. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her light blue dress hung loosely on a body that was too thin for her age. She had not finished speaking when the guest's eyes fell on her, surprised by the interruption. Before Julian could respond, the cold smile of Veronica, his impeccable wife in a black silk dress, cut across the table like a knife. "No, dear," she said with poisoned sweetness. "That's not good for you. Your father trusts me." The girl obediently lowered her head. The guests exchanged discreet, uncomfortable glances. The tension was palpable. Julian cleared his throat, smiled forcedly, and raised his wine glass as if nothing had happened. But the moment did not go unnoticed. Emilio, the maid's son, was pouring water into the glasses. He was barely 9 years old, with dark skin, messy hair, and an attentive gaze that seemed to absorb everything. He stopped short, watching as Isabella clenched her little hands on her dress, enduring her hunger. That's when the spark was lit. Emilio put the jug down on the table and suddenly turned to Julian. His childish but firm voice boomed through the room. "Your wife won't let her daughter eat." The impact was immediate. The senator dropped his fork. One of the foreign partners stifled a cough. Veronica, petrified, blinked twice before reacting. Julian froze, unable to process what he had just heard. "What did you say?" he asked in a low voice, laden with disbelief. Emilio took a deep breath. His chest rose and fell rapidly, but his words were clear, without hesitation. "She doesn't let Isabella eat. She always takes her food away, always scolds her. I've seen her hide plates in the kitchen." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. The girl pressed her lips together, unable to lift her head. Veronica reacted instantly with the theatricality of an offended actress. "How insolent!" she exclaimed, standing up abruptly. "Julian, are you going to allow this brat to humiliate us in front of your guests?" Her voice broke in a tone of false indignation, but her icy gaze was fixed on Emilio like a dagger. The guests murmured quietly. The senator, uncomfortable, leaned toward Julian. "It's all right, Herrera." Julian swallowed hard. The weight of the stairs suffocated him. His family's prestige was at stake, and that poor child, the maid's son, had just blown up the facade of perfection that he had worked so hard to maintain. "Emilio, apologize immediately," Julian ordered sternly. The boy took a step back, but he did not back down. His voice, though trembling, came out with the force of someone telling a truth that no one wants to hear. "I'm not going to apologize because it's the truth." A brutal silence fell over the dining room. Isabella burst into silent tears, covering her face with her hands. Veronica took advantage of the scene to surround the girl, hugging her with feigned tenderness. "Look what you've done with your lies, you spoiled brat," she said in a low voice, almost hissing, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Are you scaring Isabella?" Julian rose abruptly from the table. His chair fell backward with a crash. "Enough," Emilio roared. "Go with your mother to the kitchen right now." The boy clenched his fists, his eyes moist with helplessness. He wanted to speak again, but his mother's hand held him back from the doorframe. The woman, her head bowed, murmured, "Come on, son," and she dragged him out of the dining room. The guests tried to salvage the evening, but the awkwardness was unbearable. No one dared mention the incident, although their glances said it all. Julian, breathing heavily, returned to his seat. "My apologies for the scene," he said, trying to regain control. "Sometimes humble people don't know how to behave in certain environments." The senator forced a smile. The foreign partners feigned interest in their drinks, but Veronica, with a barely concealed triumphant expression, took Julian's hand under the table. "Don't worry, love. I'll take care of everything," she whispered. Julian nodded, but his gaze lingered for a moment on Isabella. The girl, pale and fragile, didn't eat another bite all night. What Julian didn't know was that this childish accusation, uttered like a desperate cry, would be the crack that would shatter the perfect glass of his mansion. The echo of Emilio's cry still lingered on the walls of the mansion when the guests left. The elegant footsteps on the marble floor of the lobby mingled with forced smiles, hurried goodbyes, and polite phrases that hid the discomfort. "Thank you for coming, really," Julian said with a stiff smile as he shook hands. No one mentioned what had happened in the dining room, but the looks on the faces of the foreign partners spoke louder than any words. The senator patted him on the shoulder paternalistically as he said goodbye. "Keep a closer eye on your staff, Herrera. Scenes like this damage reputations." When the front door closed and the house fell silent, the weight of the scandal fell on Julian with crushing force. He walked toward the living room with a frown, his steps firm and tense. Veronica followed closely behind him with the impeccable poise of someone who never loses her composure. Isabel trailed behind like a small, fragile shadow, her eyes red from crying. In the hallway, Julian turned abruptly toward Emilio and his mother, who stood motionless next to the kitchen. "What you did tonight is unforgivable," he thundered, pointing his finger at the boy. "How dare you make up such a lie in front of my guests?" Emilio's mother lowered her head, squeezing the boy's arm. "Sir, please be quiet," Julian interrupted. "You have made my family look ridiculous." Emilio, his face red, wanted to respond, but his mother squeezed him tighter, forcing him to be quiet. His eyes, however, remained fixed on Isabella, as if trying to tell her without words that he did not regret what he had said. Veronica approached gently, placing a hand on her husband's shoulder. "Honey, don't get upset," she murmured in a honeyed voice. "He's just a spoiled child. Understand that he makes these things up because, well, he doesn't know the real world." Julian took a deep breath, running a hand over his face. The exhaustion of the night dulled his senses, and shame gnawed at him. "Isabella, go to bed," he ordered sharply. The girl, her eyes downcast, obeyed without protest. She climbed the stairs slowly, dragging her feet until she disappeared down the second-floor hallway. Veronica smiled silently, satisfied, before taking Julian by the arm. "Come, dear, let's talk for a moment alone." She led him to the private lounge, where a faint fire crackled in the fireplace. There, with privacy assured, she dropped to her mask for a moment. "You can't allow that brat to stay here, Julian. His presence is a problem. Look what he did tonight." Her voice hardened. "He made up that charade in front of everyone to embarrass us." Julian nodded slowly. The memory of his guest's uncomfortable stares still hurt like a fresh wound. "You're right," he admitted, "but I don't want to argue anymore. We'll talk about this calmly tomorrow." Veronica tilted her head and kissed him on the cheek. "You're too good," she whispered. Meanwhile, upstairs, Isabella lay on her bed with an empty stomach. Hunger twisted her insides and tears escaped silently. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to sleep, but a sudden dizziness forced her to cling to the sheets. Everything was spinning around her. Her breathing became ragged. She staggered to her feet to go to the bathroom, but she had barely taken 3 steps when her knees buckled. She fell to the floor with a thud. The noise, though slight, echoed down the hallway. Emilio, who had not yet managed to fall asleep in his room, got up alarmed, opened the door carefully, and saw Isabella's figure on the floor. "Isabella," he whispered, running towards her. The girl's face was pale, her lips dry. "I'm hungry," she murmured, barely audibly. Emilio helped her up as best he could and carried her back to bed. He ran to his room and rummaged through a drawer until he found a broken cookie he had saved days before. He hurried back and offered it to her. Isabella took it with trembling hands and devoured it in seconds. A small spark of relief flashed across her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, before closing her eyes, exhausted. Emilio sat next to her, silently watching over her as she slept. He knew that what she had said at dinner was not a lie. He had seen it too many times. There in the dim light of the room, with the weak girl breathing barely calmly, the boy clenched his fists and thought aloud, "Someday someone will have to listen to us." The morning in the mansion dawned with an air of false normality. The windows let in soft light, illuminating the main dining room where Veronica was giving instructions to the cook. Her firm, sharp voice contrasted with the perfect smile she always showed in public. Isabella's breakfast will be only cut fruit, she said as she checked the table. No bread or eggs. The cook, a sturdy, quiet woman, nodded quickly. She had learned not to argue. Emilio watched intently from the half-open kitchen door. His instincts told him that something strange was going on, and he couldn't take his eyes off Veronica. Isabella entered shortly after, still sleepy, shuffling in her slippers. She sat down at the table and waited silently. The cook placed a small plate of apple slices in front of her. The girl smiled weakly and began to eat. But as the cook turned to serve juice, Emilio saw Veronica, with a quick, almost imperceptible movement, remove a piece of bread from the tray next to Isabella. She discreetly wrapped it in a napkin and hid it in the pocket of her robe. Emilio blinked in disbelief. Why would she take bread from a hungry girl? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't carelessness. It was intentional. His heart began to beat faster. He took a step back, fearing he would be discovered. Veronica, as if she could feel his eyes on her, turned abruptly. "What are you doing there, Emilio?" she asked sharply. The boy shuddered. "Nothing, ma'am. I just came for a glass of water." Veronica stared at him for a few seconds until a calculated smile appeared on her face. "Then take the water and go back to your duties." Emilio obeyed, but that image remained etched in his mind. That same afternoon, the scene was repeated in a different way. The cook had prepared soup for everyone. Emilio, helping to serve, noticed that Veronica approached Isabella's plate before bringing it to the table. She took a small bottle out of her pocket, opened it discreetly, and poured a few drops into the broth. Then she stirred with her spoon as if nothing had happened. Emilio froze. His breathing stopped for a moment. The cook entered just then, noticing nothing. Veronica smiled as if she had only been tasting the soup. "Perfect flavor," she said, and left with the plate in her hands. Emilio clenched his teeth. He had to do something. He ran to his room, opened a drawer, and took out an old cell phone he had inherited from a cousin. The camera was scratched and barely worked, but at that moment it was his only tool. The next day, he waited hidden in the hallway next to the kitchen. His heart was beating so hard that he was afraid it would be heard. And then it happened. Veronica approached Isabella's plate again. Again, saw and entered the jar. Again, the quick gesture. Emilio, with trembling hands, raised the cell phone and pressed the button. A metallic click and a soft vibration confirmed the photo. The boy immediately lowered the device, hiding it under his shirt. His breathing was heavy, but a spark of triumph shone in his eyes. He had managed to capture something. That night, locked in his room, he reviewed the image. The screen was cracked and the photo was blurry. Veronica was barely distinguishable, leaning over a plate with a small object in her hand. It wasn't definitive proof. At first glance, it could be anything. Just a woman serving soup. Emilio bit his lower lip. Doubt gnawed at him. Should he show Julian the photo, or would that only make things worse? He remembered what had happened at dinner. Isabella's father had humiliated him in front of everyone. He had treated him like a liar. If he showed him such an unclear photo now, he would probably laugh at him, or worse still, get angry again. But when he thought of Isabella, her pale face, her weak voice asking for food, his fear turned to determination. Maybe that photo wasn't enough, but it was a start. He hid it in the secret pocket of his backpack, vowing to himself that he would not give up. On the other side of the mansion, Isabella slept restlessly while Veronica walked silently through the hallways, like an elegant and dangerous shadow. And in that nocturnal silence, Emilio realized something terrifying. What he had seen was not a mistake. It was a plan. The next morning, the atmosphere in the mansion was heavy. There were no guests, no laughter, only a thick silence interrupted by the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. Isabella had not yet come down from her room, and the cook was preparing a breakfast that would probably end up in Veronica's hands before it reached the girl's table. Julian was in his office reviewing documents when Veronica entered with a firm step, carrying a folder in her hands. Her face, impeccable as always, was adorned with an expression of false concern. "We need to talk, Julian," she said, closing the door behind her. He looked up wearily. What now? Veronica sat down across from him, crossing her legs elegantly. It's about your employee and her son. Julian frowned. What about them? She sighed as if she were carrying a huge weight on her shoulders. I don't want to sound cruel, but last night was the last straw. We can't allow an insolent child to interrupt such an important dinner, let alone accuse me of absurd things. She paused dramatically. His mother doesn't set limits either. She lets them talk too much and interfere where they shouldn't. Julian remembered the awkward moment in the dining room, the uncomfortable looks from his partners, the senator's words warning him about his reputation. He felt a knot in his stomach. I don't know, maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Veronica interrupted him with a firm gesture. No, Julian, this is not a misunderstanding, it is disobedience. And disobedience in this house cannot be tolerated. Do you want your staff to disrespect you in front of your guests again? He fell silent. The folder on the desk trembled in his hands. So, do you want me to fire them? He finally asked. For the good of the family, she replied with that poisonous sweetness she used when she knew she had won. Hours later, Emilio's mother, a woman with a tired but dignified look, heard the news directly from Julian. I'm very sorry, Teresa, but we can no longer count on your services, he said, avoiding her gaze. She didn't respond immediately, but pressed her lips together, took a deep breath, and nodded silently. It wasn't the first time she had faced injustice, but it hurt more because she knew it wasn't because of her work, but because of her son's voice. Emilio, who was standing next to her, stepped forward. It's not fair, he exclaimed, looking directly at Julian. We didn't do anything wrong. Julian's gaze hardened. What you did was very serious, Emilio. You accused my wife without proof. That will not be tolerated. The boy clenched his fists. His eyes glowed with rage and restrained tears. But it's the truth, he shouted, his voice breaking. Your daughter isn't sick. They're making her sick. The words echoed in the office like a sharp blow. Julian stood up immediately. Enough, he roared in a tone that echoed off the walls. I will not tolerate any more insolence. Teresa hugged her son, trying to calm him down. Emilio, please. But the boy did not take his eyes off Julian. His face burned with helplessness. And even though he knew that his voice could cost him even more, he did not back down. If you don't believe me, look at her, he said, pointing to the door where Veronica had just appeared, feigning surprise at the scene. You trust her because you don't see her when no one else is looking. The silence became unbearable. Veronica, with a cold smile, approached and placed her hand on Julian's shoulder. Poor thing, he's scared in saying anything. She whispered as if she were the voice of reason. Julian closed his eyes for a moment, torn between doubt and loyalty. But when he opened them again, he had made up his mind. You better pack your things, he said coldly. Teresa nodded with teary eyes, took Emilio's hand, and led him to the exit. The boy, however, turned once more before leaving. His voice came out shaky, but full of conviction. Someday you'll realize that what I'm saying is true, and I hope that day won't be too late. The door closed behind them, leaving a bitter silence in the hallway. Julian leaned exhausted against the desk. Veronica leaned over him, stroking his hair with feigned tenderness. You did the right thing, my love. Peace will return to our home. But somewhere deep inside, an uncomfortable echo resonated in Julian's mind. The boy's words, spoken with such certainty, continued to vibrate like a warning impossible to ignore. The morning sun bathed the elementary school playground in warm light. The children ran, laughed, and played on the swings. Among them, Isabella walked slowly with her backpack slung over her shoulder. Her pink dress seemed too big for her, as if the body that should have filled it had shrunk over time. When she arrived in the classroom, Teacher Rodriguez noticed something strange. The girl sat down at her desk and rested her head on her arms, as if carrying the weight of her own body was too much. Are you okay, Isabella? Asked the teacher, leaning toward her. The girl forced a weak smile. Yes, sir, I'm just tired. The day passed between notebooks and pencils, but Isabella could barely hold hers. Her handwriting became clumsy. The lines slanted as if the strength was slipping from her hands. At recess, while the other children shared cookies and juice, Isabella sat alone on a bench. Her eyes followed the movements of the others, the rustling of the potato chip bags, the aroma of the stuffed bread they took out of their lunch boxes. Her stomach growled, but she didn't dare ask for anything. That's when it happened. As she stood up, her knees buckled. The girl staggered 2 steps and fell hard to the ground. The murmur of the playground died down in an instant. "Isabella!" shouted a classmate. The children crowded around her, and the teacher rushed over immediately. She found the girl pale, with dry lips and closed eyes. "Call the nurse quickly." Chaos broke out. One of the school secretaries picked up the phone and dialed the contact number. "Mr. Herrera, your daughter has fainted. You need to come immediately." Julian arrived at the school in less than 20 minutes, his driver barely controlling the car. Upon entering the nursing room, he found Isabella lying on a stretcher with a damp cloth on her forehead. "My girl!" he exclaimed, taking her in. Isabella slowly opened her eyes. "Dad." Her voice was barely a whisper. Julian felt a lump in his throat. Teacher Rodriguez spoke softly but firmly. "Mr. Herrera, this isn't the first time Isabella has shown signs of weakness. We've seen her tired, distracted, without energy. Today her body couldn't take it anymore." Julian nodded solemnly. "I'll take her to the hospital right now." Hours later, in pediatrician Mariana Torres's office, the atmosphere was tense. Isabella was sitting on the stretcher in a white gown that was too big for her. Mariana, a middle-aged woman with a firm and compassionate gaze, reviewed the preliminary tests. "Mr. Herrera," she began, removing her glasses, "your daughter shows clear signs of malnutrition." Julian opened his eyes in disbelief. "Malnutrition? That's impossible. My wife makes sure she has a special, healthy diet." Mariana interrupted him gently but bluntly. "What I see in these results does not correspond to a well-fed child. Isabella has iron deficiency, protein deficiency, and considerable weight loss. Her body is not getting what it needs." Julian ran his hand through his hair in despair, but Veronica assured me that everything was under control, that natural diets were better than... The pediatrician looked him in the eye seriously. "With all due respect, Mr. Herrera, diets cannot justify this condition. If we don't correct this immediately, the long-term damage could be serious." Isabella then looked at him with big, wet eyes. "Daddy, I'm always hungry," she whispered in a thin voice. Julian felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. The image of dinner, Emilio's accusation, the words he had decided to ignore, all came back to hit him hard. Mariana continued in a firm tone. "I need to know exactly what Isabella is eating at home. And if anyone is controlling or restricting her diet, you need to know." Julian remained silent. The echo of Emilio's last words resonated in his head. "Your daughter is not sick. They are making her sick." When they returned to the mansion, Veronica was waiting for them at the entrance, impeccable with her serene smile. "What did the doctor say?" she asked, feigning concern. Julian held Isabella in his arms. The girl hid her face in his chest as if she didn't want to meet her stepmother's gaze. "Nothing conclusive yet," Julian lied in a harsh voice. Veronica caressed the girl's forehead. "Poor dear, always so fragile. You'll see how you'll recover with my care." Isabella closed her eyes, resisting the contact. Julian noticed it, and that small reaction sparked a spark of doubt in him that he couldn't extinguish. That night, while the house slept, Julian remained in his study, staring into the void. The pediatrician's words, his daughter's tears, and Emilio's accusations intertwined in his mind like pieces of a puzzle that was slowly beginning to take shape. For the first time, Julian was not so sure of his own truth. The mansion was silent at dawn, too silent. After Isabella's breakdown at school, the atmosphere seemed heavy, as if every corner held a secret. Julian locked himself in his office early in the morning without explanation. Isabella slept in her room under the watchful eye of a temporary nurse hired by the pediatrician. Meanwhile, Emilio was still there. The dismissal had not yet been finalized because his mother had to finish some pending tasks before leaving for good. That gave him time, and he knew it. That morning, while helping to tidy up the kitchen, a detail caught his attention. The cupboard where the condiments were kept had a messy corner, something strange in a kitchen so controlled by Veronica. When he opened it, he noticed that behind the spice jars there was a dark hole. He reached in and his fingers touched something cold. He carefully pulled out a small glass jar with clear liquid inside. The container had no label, just a metal screw cap. Emilio frowned. It wasn't salt, it wasn't oil, it wasn't anything he had seen in the kitchen before. He quickly put the jar in his pocket when he heard footsteps in the hallway. It was Veronica. She came in like a whirlwind, scanning every corner with her eyes. "What are you doing here?" she asked sharply. "I'm helping my mom," replied the boy, trying to sound natural. She watched him for a few seconds, then leaned toward him and said with a cold smile, "Don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong. Do I understand?" Emilio nodded, swallowing hard. Veronica left the kitchen, but he could feel his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. He knew he shouldn't get too confident. If she had caught him once, she could do it again. That afternoon, while everyone was resting, Emilio returned to the kitchen with his cell phone hidden under his shirt. He opened the cupboard again and began to search calmly. What he found took his breath away. Behind several bags of rice and flour, there were at least 5 more jars of different sizes. Some contained white powders, others yellowish liquids. None had labels. Emilio picked up his cell phone with trembling hands and began to photograph them one by one. The light coming in through the window illuminated the jars, and although the camera was old, the images were much clearer than the last time. As he took the photos, he wondered silently, what are these things? Medicine? Poison? Why would they be hidden here? The sound of the cell phone's shutter startled him. He looked toward the door, fearing that someone had heard him. Nothing, only silence. He put the jars back exactly as he had found them and hid the cell phone in his pocket. Later in his room, he looked at the images carefully. This time, the photos clearly showed the glass containers, the shine of the liquid, the texture of the powder. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was much more solid than a blurry image of a suspicious movement. Emilio bit his lip. He knew he should show those photos to Julian, but he also remembered the man's fury when he accused him in public. What if he didn't believe him again? The boy put the cell phone under his pillow and lay down on the bed. He stared at the ceiling restlessly. Inside, something told him he couldn't give up. Isabella needed him, even if she didn't dare ask for help yet. Across the hall, Veronica entered the kitchen. She moved some wares and counted precisely how much she knew. A barely perceptible smile crossed her face, as if she knew someone had been snooping. The mansion slept in thick silence. It was past midnight, and the dimly lit corridors seemed like endless passages. From the master bedroom, a faint glow escaped under the closed door. Inside, Veronica stood in front of the dressing table with a glass of wine in her hand. She looked at herself in the mirror intently, as if studying every feature of her face. Her makeup had been removed, revealing hard, precise features without the friendly smile she always showed in society. "How easy it is to fool them," she whispered with a crooked smile. She set the glass on the table and opened a small hidden drawer in the dressing table. Inside was a case lined with black velvet. She took it out carefully and placed it in front of the mirror. When she opened it, several small bottles appeared, identical to the ones Emilio had seen in the kitchen. She patiently lined them up on the surface, like a jeweler displaying her most precious pieces. "A few drops here and a little there," she murmured. "No one suspects anything." She leaned toward the mirror, looking into her own dark eyes. "Julian is so predictable, always wanting to believe the best in people, and I make sure I am that person." She picked up one of the bottles and slowly turned it between her fingers. Poor Isabella, always so fragile, so docile. She doesn't even have the strength to protest. And as long as she remains weak, I will be in control. She laughed softly, a brief cold sound. "I don't need to kill her," she continued, as if sharing a secret with herself. "Just keep her weak. Let Julian believe that his little girl needs special care and that only I can give her that care." She rearranged the bottles with obsessive precision. "As long as he trusts me, my fortune is assured. No doctor, no maid, and certainly not that cheeky brat is going to ruin it." Her face hardened as she uttered the last word. She slammed the case shut and put it in the drawer. She stood up and walked across the room, her silk robe brushing the floor. Her thoughts were a silent torrent. "Julian doubts. I can see it in his eyes, but it doesn't matter. He always comes back to trust me. He can't bear the thought of his perfect life falling apart, and I make sure it stays perfect in my own way." He stopped by the window, looking out at the dark gardens. The wind moved the branches of the trees, and in the distance, he could see the dim light of the staff cottage. "That boy," he murmured, frowning. "He thinks he can challenge me. He has courage, I admit, but his days here are also numbered." He closed the curtains with a jerk. When he leaves, no one will remember his words. and Julian will have only me to trust. He approached the mirror again and sat down on the dressing table chair. She stared at her reflection for a long time. Little by little, she rehearsed different smiles. The sweet one, the compassionate one, the understanding one, the mask she wore every day. "You see, Isabella," she said softly, as if the girl could hear her from the other room. "I decide what you eat, when you eat, how much you eat. I decide how strong or weak you are." She rested her elbow on the table and dropped her chin into her palm. "And your father is so blind. He prefers to believe my word rather than your sad eyes." She was silent for a few seconds. Then, in an almost affectionate whisper, she added, "In the end, he'll thank me, because I'm the only thing that keeps this house in order. Without me, everything would fall apart." The clock struck 1 a.m. Veronica put the bottles back in the secret drawer, drank the last sip of wine, and lay down on the bed. She stared at the ceiling for a long time with her lips curved in a serene smile, as if she had found pleasure in her own thoughts. She closed her eyes, convinced that everything was under control. But in the silence of the night, the mansion held invisible witnesses, the walls that had heard her confession and the darkness that seemed heavier than ever. Veronica's mask, perfect in public, had fallen in private, and although no one else knew it yet, the reader had already seen her true face. Dawn brought with it an eerie silence. Julian came down the stairs of the mansion, with his tie still askew and his eyes tired. He had hardly slept. The image of Isabella collapsing at school haunted him like a shadow. Upon entering the dining room, he found his daughter already seated with a plate in front of her, a few slices of apple and a glass of water. "Nothing else? Is that all you had for breakfast?" Julian asked, stopping in front of her. Isabella looked down. "Aunt Vero says I shouldn't eat much. That way I'll get better faster." The girl's voice was soft, almost resigned. Julian felt an uncomfortable tingling in his stomach. "And what do you want?" he insisted. She timidly looked up and whispered, "I want bread, Dad." The silence that followed was like a blow. Julian looked around. The bread basket that used to be on the table was gone. He turned toward the kitchen. "Where's the bread?" he asked in a harsher voice than usual. The cook, who had her back turned as she washed utensils, hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mrs. Veronica asked me to put it away, sir." Julian clenched his jaw, took Isabella's hand, and led her into the kitchen. He opened the cupboard and after a moment of searching, found the bag of bread wrapped in several napkins, placed it on the table, and served 2 slices on a plate. "Eat," he said to Isabella. The girl hesitated, as if fearing a reprimand, but finally she took a piece and devoured it in silence. The look of relief on her face pierced Julian like a knife. At that moment, Veronica appeared in the doorway. "Honey, what are you doing?" she asked, feigning surprise. "I'm giving my daughter some bread," Julian replied curtly. Veronica smiled, though her eyes flashed with irritation. "I don't want you to get the wrong idea, honey. Bread is bad for her stomach. I'm just trying to take care of her." Julian watched her silently for a few seconds. For the first time, he did not immediately accept her explanation. That night, as the mansion sank into calm, Julian remained awake in his study. He lit a cigarette, a habit he had given up years ago, and let the smoke fill the air. On the desk was a framed photograph. His first wife, Clara, smiling with Isabella in her arms when she was just a baby. The memory tugged at his heart. Clara had always been thoughtful with the girl, attentive, loving. She would never have allowed her to go hungry. "I trusted Veronica too soon," Julian thought, clutching the photo in his hands. Clara's voice, like an echo from another time, seemed to whisper to him from his memory. "Promise me you'll always take care of Isabella." Julian closed his eyes. The promise was still there, intact, but he had delegated that care to another woman, and now he was beginning to suspect that he had made an unforgivable mistake. The next day, a new detail increased his doubts. During lunch, he noticed that Isabella's plate was smaller than everyone else's, with just rice and a few vegetables. The girl tried to ask for more, but before she could open her mouth, Veronica stepped in. "No, dear, remember what we talked about." Julian interrupted her. "Give her more." Veronica looked at him in surprise with a frozen smile. "Are you sure? I don't want her to feel sick later." "I'm sure," Julian said firmly. The cook served another portion under their watchful gaze. Isabella ate with restrained hunger, as if she feared her plate would be taken away at any moment. Julian watched her in silence. Inside, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Something didn't add up. That afternoon, Julian decided to explore the house on his own. He walked through the kitchen, the pantry, the hallways. He looked with different eyes, searching for what had previously gone unnoticed. He noticed that certain foods were disappearing too quickly, as if someone were hiding them. A tray of cookies had been removed without explanation. A carton of milk was open and half empty. Although Isabella had barely had a glass, his instincts alerted him. He could no longer ignore it. That night, unable to sleep, he returned to the study, sat down at the desk, and opened a drawer. There he found the personal diary of Clara, Isabella's mother. He flipped through the pages until he came across old notes about his daughter's diet. She loves bread with honey. She always asks for seconds of soup. She never sleeps without a glass of milk. Tears threatened to cloud his vision. Clara had taken care of every detail of Isabella's life, and he, in his eagerness to rebuild his life, had handed his daughter over to the will of another person. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself. The doubt previously suppressed now grew like an unstoppable storm. For the first time, Julian realized that something in his home was deeply wrong, and that perhaps, just perhaps, Emilio had been right all along. The afternoon had turned gray at the mansion. A storm loomed on the horizon, and the windows reflected dark clouds that seemed to foreshadow something imminent. Emilio had been hesitating for hours, pacing in circles around the small room where he slept with his mother. The old cell phone trembled in his hands, the images of the vials glowing on the cracked screen. He knew it was risky, but he also knew he could no longer remain silent. Isabella was looking weaker every day, and her fall at school had been just a warning. He took a deep breath, pressed the device to his chest, and walked decisively toward Julian's office. Julian was reviewing documents when he heard a timid knock on the door. "Come in," he said without looking up. Emilio entered slowly, his shoulders tense and his cell phone in his hand. "I need to talk to you," Julian muttered. He looked at him with a frown. "The scandal you caused last time wasn't enough for you." Emilio swallowed but didn't back down. "I'm not lying. This time I have proof." He held out his cell phone. The screen showed the photos he had taken in the kitchen. The jars were lined up, some with strange liquids, others with powders. Julian took the device and looked at it closely. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked. "This is what your wife hides in the kitchen," Emilio explained in a firm voice. "I found them behind the bags of flour. She uses them in Isabella's food." Julian felt a chill run down his spine. The memory of the pediatrician talking about malnutrition came back to his mind. Before he could respond, the office door opened with a squeak. Veronica entered, impeccable as always, with a folder in her hands. When she saw Emilio, she stopped dead in her tracks. "What is this boy doing here?" she asked, her voice laden with venom. Emilio took a step back but did not hide the cell phone. "I'm showing him the truth," said Veronica. She approached slowly with an icy smile. "Truth?" she repeated mockingly. "You call a couple of blurry photos taken with a broken phone the truth?" She turned to Julian. "Honey, do you see what's going on? This brat is manipulating images to make us believe that I'm doing something wrong." Julian remained silent. Veronica looked him straight in the eye, her expression oscillating between indignation and feigned tenderness. "Are you really going to question my word for that of a resentful child?" she said in a trembling voice. "Julian, I've taken care of your daughter as if she were my own. I've done everything for her, and now you repay me by distrusting me." The words hit home. Julian looked down at his cell phone. The photos were there, yes, but they did not irrefutably prove what Emilio claimed. The boy, desperate, raised his voice. "I saw her. I saw her putting things on Isabella's plate." Veronica feigned a swoon. "You see, he's obsessed with me. He doesn't want his mother to lose her job, so he makes up stories that are increasingly serious." She put her hand to her chest as if she were hurt. "This is a plot against me, Julian. You don't see it, but it is." At that moment, Isabella was walking down the hall. She had heard the raised voices and stopped in front of the half-open door. She didn't want to eavesdrop, but Emilio's desperate tone drew her in. "She's making him sick." She managed to hear it along with Veronica's fake crying. The girl felt a knot in her stomach. It really was her fault that everyone was arguing. Was she a burden to everyone? She hugged herself, trembling. She took a few steps back, but the words continued to echo in her head. In the office, Julian was torn. He looked at Emilio with fiery determination in his eyes, and then at Veronica, who was playing on the fragility of a wounded wife. I don't know what to believe, he finally muttered. Emilio felt the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Please, just look at Isabella, he begged. Can't you see she's getting weaker every day? Veronica let out a convincing sob and clung to Julian's arm. Love, don't let this child destroy our family. Julian ran his hand over his exhausted face. Doubt consumed him, but his heart still clung to the trust he had placed in Veronica. Leave me alone, he finally ordered in a deep voice. Emilio wanted to protest, but the millionaire's gaze was uncompromising. He lowered his head and left the room. His mother was waiting for him in the hallway with a worried look on her face. Veronica, on the other hand, stayed a few seconds longer, drying tears that had never existed. I hope you understand that I am the only one who really cares about you and Isabella, she said softly before leaving. When the door closed, Julian slumped into his chair. The photos were still on the cell phone on the desk. His mind oscillated between the image of the bottles and Veronica's sweet voice swearing loyalty. The storm raging outside seemed to mirror the one raging inside him. Two opposing realities that could not coexist. And in the middle of it all, Isabella, the girl who had hurt enough to carry a guilt that did not belong to her. The mansion was in darkness when the punishment fell on Isabella. She had tried to speak, had said just a couple of sentences in a low voice. But for Veronica, it was enough. If you insist on lying, you will have to learn what it means to obey, the woman whispered, her tone soft as silk, yet laden with an icy threat. With a sharp gesture, she closed the door to Isabella's room and turned the key from the outside. The metallic click echoed in the hallway like a sentence. Isabella stood staring at the closed door. Fear rose in her throat. She knocked weakly at first, then harder. Aunt Vero, please don't leave me here. The echo was her only response. The hours passed slowly. The girl curled up on the bed with her hands on her empty stomach. Her breathing grew heavier. She felt dizzy as if the walls were moving. At one point, she crawled to the window, but it was locked. She could only peek through the curtains and see the dark gardens. A cold wind rustled the branches of the trees. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She was hungry, a hunger that hurt like needles in her stomach. She tried to distract herself by singing softly a song her biological mother used to sing when she was a baby, but she could barely remember the melody. Her voice broke into a sob. Mama, in another corner of the mansion, Emilio couldn't sleep. He had heard the click of the key earlier and knew that Veronica had done something. He tiptoed down the hall, pressing his ear against the doors. When he reached Isabella's room, he heard a muffled sob on the other side. Isabella, he whispered, tapping gently on the wood. Are you there? The girl replied in a faint voice. They won't let me out. I'm hungry. Emilio clenched his fists, looked around to make sure no one was there, and then tried to turn the handle. No use. It was locked. Wait, I'll help you, he said with a determination that belied his young age. The boy ran to his room, searched through his things until he found a bent piece of wire he had once used to fix a broken toy. He returned to Isabella's room and inserted it into the lock. His hands were shaking, but he persisted again and again. The metal scraped, the mechanism creaked. From inside, Isabella encouraged him in a weak voice. You did it. Not yet, but I'm not giving up. Cold sweat ran down Emilio's forehead. His heart was racing as if every second counted. Suddenly, he heard footsteps in the hallway. He froze, put away the wire, and crouched against the wall. It was Veronica. She walked by with a candle in her hand, her dark eyes scanning every corner like a nocturnal predator. Emilio held his breath until she disappeared up the stairs. Only then did he try again. Finally, after several attempts, the click of the lock sounded like a victory. The door opened slowly. Isabella was lying on the bed, pale with glassy eyes. Isabella, Emilio whispered, running towards her. The girl barely managed a smile when she saw him. I knew you would come. He took a small piece of stale bread out of his pocket that he had secretly saved. He broke it into pieces and gave it to her. Isabella ate it with trembling hands, as if each crumb were a treasure. Thank you, she murmured, lying back down. Emilio covered her with a blanket. Don't worry, I won't let anything happen to you. The boy sat by the bed watching the door, fearing that Veronica would return at any moment. The night passed slowly, marked by the ticking of a distant clock and Isabella's faint sighs. The confinement had been cruel, a punishment that went beyond discipline. Emilio knew this, even though he did not yet fully understand the magnitude of it. But one thing was clear in his heart. The fear did not matter. The threats did not matter. As long as he was there, Isabella would not be alone. And although the walls of the mansion seemed to hold more secrets than he could imagine, that night Emilio swore he would find a way to protect her, even if he had to defy all the adults who called him a liar. Dawn had left the mansion in a state of deceptive calm. The wind blew against the windows in gusts that sounded like whispers. Emilio, sitting next to Isabella's bed, fought against sleep. The girl was asleep, but her breathing was irregular. Every so often, she opened her eyes as if to make sure he was still there. The boy had barely closed his eyelids when he heard a moan. Isabella stirred restlessly, bringing her hands to her belly. "It hurts," she murmured. Emilio leaned toward her. Her face was paler than ever, and sweat beaded on her forehead. She tried to get up, but her legs trembled, and she fell to her knees beside the bed. "Isabella," Emilio whispered, shaking her gently. The girl barely responded with a babble. Her lips were dry and her eyes glassy. Fear struck him full force. Emilio knew he couldn't solve this alone anymore. "Help!" he shouted with all his might. His voice echoed in the empty hallway. He slammed the open door against the wall to make more noise. "Mr. Herrera, help, please." Footsteps echoed in the hallway seconds later. Julian appeared disheveled, his face marked by insomnia. "What's going on here?" he asked, bursting in. The scene froze him. Isabella, on the floor next to the bed, was slowly slipping into unconsciousness. Emilio held her in his arms, his eyes filled with tears. "Look at her," the boy exclaimed. "She can't even get up." Julian ran toward them, picking up his daughter in his arms. The girl's body was light, too light, as if she had no strength of her own. "Isabella's, my love," he whispered in a broken voice. The girl barely opened her eyes and whispered, "Daddy, I'm hungry." Those words pierced Julian like a dagger. He felt the air escape from his lungs. He remembered every time Veronica had said that Isabella was fine, that the diet was necessary, that everything was under control, and he also remembered Emilio's warnings. He could no longer deceive himself. What he saw before him was undeniable. "What's going on here?" Veronica's voice burst into the room. She stood in the doorway with her hair perfectly styled and a carefully calculated look of surprise on her face. Julian stood up with Isabella in his arms and looked at her with a new fire in his eyes. "Explain to me why my daughter is in this state," Veronica blinked, feigning confusion. "Honey, I don't know what happened. I'm sure you're exaggerating. Maybe she's just tired." "No," Julian interrupted, his voice firm and charged with contained fury. "This isn't tiredness. This is hunger." Silence fell over the room. Veronica held his gaze, but her mask of calm was beginning to crack. Emilio, still standing by the bed, took a step forward. "I told you," he murmured, his voice trembling between fear and determination. "I told you so." Julian looked down at his daughter, who was barely clinging to his shirt with her fragile fingers. He felt guilt wash over him in waves. Every decision he had made, every moment he had chosen to believe Veronica instead of listening to Isabella or Emilio, now weighed on him like an unbearable burden. The roar of the storm outside accompanied the whirlwind inside him. There was no longer any room for excuses or doubts. What he saw before him was the naked truth. Isabella was on the verge of collapse and Veronica was responsible. With his heart racing, he left the room carrying the girl, followed by Emilio. "Call Dr. Torres," he ordered in a grave voice, addressing an employee who peeked into the room. Veronica tried to follow them, but Julian turned with a look that stopped her in her tracks. "Not another step," he said with a sharpness in his voice she had never heard before. That night, the mansion's hallway became the scene of a silent battle. The fragile innocence of a girl held in her arms, the unexpected courage of a poor boy who didn't give up, and the fall of a woman's mask whose power was beginning to crumble. For the first time, Julian was not blind. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. The storm was still raging outside the mansion when Julian went down to the main hall. He still had the image of Isabella fainting in his arms fresh in his mind. He had left her under temporary medical supervision in one of the rooms closest to his. Emilio remained nearby, vigilant, but now Julian walked with determined steps toward the room where Veronica was waiting for him. He found her sitting on the sofa with her legs crossed and a glass of wine in her hand. Her expression was calm, too calm, as if nothing had happened. "Do you want to explain to me what the hell is going on?" Julian asked harshly. Veronica looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Honey, I understand that you're upset, but you can't talk to me like that." "My daughter almost fainted in my arms," he roared. "She's weak, hungry, and you said you were taking care of her." Veronica's smile faltered for the first time. "You're exaggerating," Sigmund replied, trying to sound calm. "Isabella has always been delicate. I'm just following a special regimen to strengthen her." Julian slammed his fist on the table. "Enough with the lies." He took Emilio's cell phone out of his pocket where the photos of the jars were still stored. He threw it on the table in front of her. "Explain this to me, Veronica." She looked at the images and let out a dry laugh. "That, some blurry photos taken by a resentful child. That's what you're using to accuse me." "I don't need them to be clear," said Julian, moving closer. "I saw it in my daughter's eyes. I heard it from her lips." "I'm hungry. You've been depriving her of the most basic things." Veronica slammed her glass down on the table and stood up. Her eyes flashed with contained rage. "So now you're calling me a liar after everything I've done for you. What have you done?" Julian leaned toward her, their faces inches apart. "Manipulating a child, convincing me she was fragile when in reality you were weakening her." Veronica's face changed, the sweetness evaporated, her features hardened, her lips curled into a sneer. "You finally understand," she whispered, her voice thick with venom. Julian took a step back, surprised by the harshness in her tone. "What are you saying?" She began to pace around the room like a caged beast. "You thought it was all love and devotion, that I was only here to fill the void left by that dead woman." She turned abruptly, glaring at him with fury. "But I always knew that the only thing you cared about was that girl." Julian clenched his fists. "Don't you dare." "Oh, yes," Veronica shouted, her eyes wide. "That sickly creature was always your priority. And I had to settle for being second best, so I decided to make sure you could never ignore me." Silence fell like a hammer blow. Julian felt a void in his chest, a blow of reality that knocked the wind out of him. "What have you done?" he asked, barely audible. Veronica smiled with chilling coldness. "Nothing irreversible, just a little control. A weak Isabella means a dependent Julian. As long as she needs my care, you need me." The words echoed in the room like thunder. Julian took a step forward, his face red with anger. "You're a monster." Veronica let out a bitter laugh. "Monster? No, realist. In this world, power is not maintained with tenderness. It is maintained with control. You were too blind to see it." He pointed at her with a finger trembling with rage. "You have played with my daughter's life, and I will never forgive you for that." Veronica moved so close to him that he could feel her breath. "You don't have the guts to destroy me," she whispered with a crooked smile. "Because if you do, your whole life will fall apart. Your partners, your friends, what will they think if they find out you didn't see what was happening?" "Under your own roof," the words hit home. Julian closed his eyes for a moment, torn between rage and guilt. When he opened them again, his pupils glowed with determination. "I'd rather face the shame than continue living this lie." Veronica watched him silently, assessing him as if she were measuring whether the man in front of her was the same one she had manipulated for so long. For the first time, she knew that the balance had shifted. The rain pounded on the windows like a war drum. The confrontation had reached a point of no return. Julian had seen the woman without her masks, and what he saw filled him with hatred and revulsion. She, on the other hand, understood that she could no longer hide behind smiles and excuses. Her true self was exposed, and in that room lit by lightning, the psychological battle ended with only one outcome. Trust had been broken forever. The morning dawned gray over the Herrera mansion. The sky was covered with heavy clouds that seemed to press against the windows. Julian had been awake for hours, pacing back and forth in his study, his face gaunt and his hands clenched. In front of him on the table lay the photos taken by Emilio and Dr. Torres's medical notes. Each page, Each image was a direct blow to the denial that had kept him blind for months. Finally, he picked up the phone. "Dr. Torres, I need you to come as soon as possible." Mariana Torres arrived shortly after with a folder in her hand and a serious expression on her face. She sat down across from Julian and reviewed the documents he had gathered. "Mr. Herrera," she said in a firm voice, "these are just suspicions now. Isabella shows clear signs of induced malnutrition. There is no other reasonable explanation for her condition." Julian nodded, his face somber. "I know, and I can't hide it anymore." Mariana looked him in the eyes. "Then you must report it. Not for yourself, not for what others may think, but for Isabella." Her words hurt like a reminder, but they also pushed him to act. That same afternoon, Julian called an old family friend, lawyer Ricardo Mendez, a man with a deep voice and a penetrating gaze. Ricardo listened silently as Julian recounted everything that had happened, from Isabella's first symptoms to the confrontation with Veronica. When he finished, the lawyer closed his notebook decisively. "It's a solid case," he said. "Dr. Torres can certify the girl's clinical condition, and those photos, although not definitive evidence on their own, reinforce the pattern of behavior." Julian slumped into his chair. "I can't believe I let it get this far." "The important thing is that you are now willing to take action," Ricardo replied, "and you must do so with determination." The complaint was filed that same night with the local prosecutor's office. Mariana signed as a medical expert, describing the clinical findings that confirm malnutrition caused by food restrictions. Ricardo took care of drafting the document with surgical precision, child abuse, and attempted poisoning. When Julian signed his name at the bottom of the document, he felt a chill run through his body. It was as if each stroke of his pen cut the last thread of the lie he had been living. 2 days later, the police arrived at the mansion. 3 uniformed officers crossed the gate with a firm step, followed by a bailiff carrying the arrest warrant. Veronica was in the living room leafing through a magazine when she heard the call from the hall. "Mrs. Veronica Lopez," the officer asked. She looked up, confused at first, then with a look of disbelief. "What is this about? You are under arrest on charges of child abuse and attempted poisoning," the officer replied sternly. The color drained from her face. "This is absurd," she shouted, standing up. "Julian, tell them to stop." Julian appeared in the doorway, his face hardened. "No more, Veronica." She looked at him incredulously, as if she didn't recognize the man she had manipulated for so long. You did this for Isabella," he replied in a grave voice. "For my daughter." The officers handcuffed Veronica. She struggled, hurling insults and promises of revenge. "You're ungrateful. Everything you have, you owe to me. Without me, you're nothing." Julian watched her silently as they took her away. There was no hatred in his eyes, only deep exhaustion and a pain that consumed him from within. When the door closed behind them, the silence in the mansion was deafening. Isabella from the upper floor had heard part of the commotion. Emilio accompanied her, holding her hand. "What happened?" the girl asked in a weak voice. Julian slowly climbed the stairs, knelt beside his daughter, and hugged her tightly. "Everything will be all right, my love. I promise." Isabella hid her face in his chest, seeking refuge. But although Julian spoke with conviction, inside he knew that the damage would not disappear so quickly. The wound was already open and would take a long time to heal. That night, when the mansion was quiet, Julian remained alone in his office, turned on a dim lamp, and let the light illuminate the portrait of Clara, his first wife. "I failed, Clara," he whispered with a broken voice. "But I swear I won't fail you again." The sound of the storm had died down, but inside his heart, a battle of guilt and regret still raged. Veronica was out of their lives, at least for now. But the shadow of what had happened continued to loom over every corner of the mansion, a reminder that legal justice was not enough to heal emotional justice. Isabella's room was transformed into a sanctuary of care. The curtains were replaced with lighter ones, allowing the morning light to flood every corner. On the nightstand, a bouquet of fresh flowers perfumed the air, and the soft sound of a clock accompanied the calm. Pediatrician Mariana Torres had set up a gradual feeding plan. Each meal had to be supervised, each portion carefully measured. It was not a matter of restoring her strength overnight, but of slowly rebuilding a body that had been cruelly weakened. Isabella lay among white pillows with her hair loose over her shoulders. Her cheeks were still pale, but when she opened her eyes that morning, a spark of life shone in them. Julian sat beside her, his shirt wrinkled and his eyes tired from so many sleepless nights. When he saw her wake up, he gently took her hand. "Hello, my love." Isabella smiled weakly. "I'm hungry, Dad." Julian's heart skipped a beat. That phrase, which days ago had sounded like a desperate cry, was now a whisper full of hope. "Then let's eat," he replied tenderly. Mariana entered shortly after with a tray. On it was a small plate with warm broth, a slice of toast, and a glass of milk. "We'll start slowly today," said the doctor. "The important thing is for her stomach to get used to it again." She placed the tray on the table and Julian brought it closer to Isabella. The girl took the spoon with trembling hands and tasted the broth. The flavor elicited a sigh of relief. Emilio, who was watching from the doorway, took a step forward. "Is it good?" he asked timidly. Isabella looked at him and nodded with a sincere smile. "Yes, thank you." No further explanation was needed. They both knew that the breadcrumbs he had secretly given her had been her salvation on dark nights. Now, eating in front of him had even greater meaning, a shared victory. The following days were a slow but steady process. Each bite was celebrated as a triumph. Isabella tried new foods, fresh fruit, mild soups, small portions of rice. Sometimes she got tired quickly, but she insisted on continuing. "I want to run with my friends again," she said with childlike determination. Julian listened to her with tears in his eyes, proud of her strength. One afternoon, as the girl finished a plate of mashed potatoes, she looked up at Emilio, who was sitting next to her. "Would you like to try some?" she offered with a smile. He shook his head. "It's yours. You need to eat more." But Isabella insisted, holding out the spoon with disarming sweetness. "I want to share it with you." Emilio accepted a small bite. The simple, natural gesture moved Julian to tears. The nights, however, remained fraught with intense emotions. Isabel would sometimes wake her up crying, prey to nightmares in which doors were locked and hunger devoured her. At those moments, Julian would sit next to her and stroke her hair. "It's over, my love. No one will ever lock you up again." Emilio, from his bed in the next room, would sometimes run when he heard the soy sauce. He would sit at the foot of the bed and tell her made-up stories. Adventures in the garden, paper castles, dragons that fled at the first scream. Isabella would listen until she fell asleep again, secure in the knowledge that she was not alone. One day, Mariana met with Julian in the hallway. "She is responding well to treatment," said the doctor. "But remember, her recovery is not only physical. She will need to feel safe, protected." Julian nodded gravely. "I'll do whatever it takes." The doctor looked at him with compassion. "You can't erase what happened, but you can build something new." Julian thought of his daughter, of the shy smile that was slowly returning, and the way she would look for Emilio whenever she needed comfort. He understood that this rebuilding would not be done with food alone, but with love and companionship. The first time Isabella managed to eat an entire plate without stopping, everyone at the table applauded softly. She blushed, laughing, and raised her spoon as if it were a trophy. "See, Dad? I did it." "Yes, you did, Princess," Julian replied, kissing her forehead. Emilio at his side gave her a thumbs up in victory. It was in that moment, amid smiles and tears, that Julian understood something profound. The storm had left scars, but it had also sown the seeds of new hope. Isabella was awakening from the darkness, and she was not doing it alone. The mansion was calm, too calm. Isabella slept soundly in her room, regaining her strength while Emilio rested in the chair next to her bed like a silent guardian. Julian, however, could find no peace. He paced the study with a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes fixed on the fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled, illuminating the walls covered with books and family portraits. In one of them, Clara, his first wife, smiled with Isabella in her arms. Just a baby with round cheeks and bright eyes. The contrast was unbearable. "I failed you, Clara," he murmured, his voice breaking. He slumped into the leather armchair, burying his face in his hands. Every memory hit him like a whip. Isabella asking for bread at the table, her light body in his arms as she fainted, her voice whispering, "I'm hungry." And worst of all, the times he had decided not to listen. The thoughts came rushing back with harshness. He remembered how he had defended Veronica in public, how he had silenced Emilio when he shouted the truth in front of everyone. He remembered the arrogant tone with which she called him a liar. He remembered the unfair dismissal he had almost carried out against his mother, convinced that she was the problem. It was all there in his memory, and now he saw it with unbearable clarity. How could I not have seen it? The answer was simple and painful because it was easier to believe in comfort than to face the possibility that the person to whom he had entrusted his life was destroying what he loved most. The whiskey burned his throat. Julian got up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark gardens. Outside, the wind shook the branches as if nature itself wanted to shake him. "You were a coward," he told himself. "You chose to close your eyes because the truth was too uncomfortable." A memory flashed through his mind, her voice in the hospital just hours after giving birth. "Promise me you'll always take care of her." He had responded with a firm yes, convinced that he would never disappoint her. And now, thinking about everything Isabella had suffered under his roof, he felt that promise had been broken into 1,000 pieces. He slumped back into the armchair and picked up a blank notebook. He opened the cover and began to write with trembling hand. He didn't know if they were notes, confessions, or simple outbursts, but the words flowed without stopping. "Isabella trusted me, and I wasn't there for her. Emilio shouted the truth, and I called him a liar. She trusts Veronica because it suited me to believe that my life was in order. The price of my blindness was my daughter's pain." When she finished the sentence, she dropped the pen and covered her face. The tears she had held back for so long flowed freely. Hours later, Dawn surprised her still in the study. He hadn't slept, but something inside him had changed. The weight of guilt was still there, but it was no longer just a punishment. It was also a motivation. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could build a different future. When he went up to Isabella's room, he found her having breakfast. Emilio was next to her, cutting a piece of fruit into small pieces. The girl looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Daddy, do you want to sit with me?" Julian approached, moved by the simple invitation. "Of course, princess." He sat down in front of her and watched her eat. Each bite was a reminder of how fragile she had been, but also of the strength with which she was fighting to recover. Isabel took his hand and squeezed it gently. "Don't look so sad, Dad. I'm better now." Julian couldn't hold back the tears and hugged her with a tenderness that seemed like an act of redemption. In that gesture, he understood that guilt would always be with him, but also that he had the opportunity to transform it into present love, daily dedication, and a renewed promise. Never again would he look the other way. The atmosphere in the mansion had changed. It no longer carried the same dark tension as weeks before, although the wounds were still open. A new calm was beginning to settle in the hallways. Isabella was slowly regaining her smile, and Emilio had become an inseparable companion in that recovery. One Sunday afternoon, as golden light streamed through the windows, Julian found them in the garden. Isabella, wearing a simple white dress, ran clumsily after Emilio. Her steps were still unsteady, but the laughter that burst from her throat was fresh and clean, as if she had been waiting years to sound it again. "Catch me if you can," Emilio shouted, dodging between the bushes. Isabella chased him with her arms outstretched, laughing breathlessly. Finally, she fell onto the grass, exhausted but happy. Emilio collapsed beside her, panting. "You're getting faster," he said, smiling. "Of course," Isabella replied proudly. "I'm eating well now." Julian watched them from the terrace with a heavy heart. That simple, powerful image showed him what he had been blind to for so long. Emilio had saved his daughter. That night in the dining room, Julian asked Emilio and his mother to sit at the main table. It was a simple gesture, but one laden with meaning. "I want you to eat here with us," he said firmly. Emilio looked at him in surprise. "Seriously, seriously," Julian replied, serving a plate for him. "You've earned it." Emilio's mother tried to protest, saying it wasn't appropriate, but Julian stopped her with a kind gesture. "What your son has done for Isabella is something I can never repay, and I want him to know that. In this house, you are no longer a servant, you are part of the family." Emilio's eyes sparkled. Isabella, happy, leaned toward him. "I told you, you're like my brother." The following days consolidated this new dynamic. Isabella and Emilio invented games in the garden, built houses with blankets in the living room, and drew on sheets of paper that they then stuck on the kitchen walls. One afternoon, Julian walked down the hall and found them painting together. Isabella had made a clumsy drawing of a smiling sun, and Emilio had drawn a house with large windows next to it. "It's our house," he explained proudly. Isabella nodded. "And here we are, you and me, in the window." Julian approached, took the sheet of paper, and looked at it closely. He felt a lump in his throat. That piece of paper with their childish scribbles represented more truth than all the contracts and properties he had accumulated in his life. One night, while they were having dinner, Julian raised his wine glass and looked at Emilio. "I want to thank you for something," he said in a serious voice. "If it weren't for you, Isabella wouldn't be here." The boy blushed and looked down. "I just did what I had to do." "What you did was show courage," Julian replied. "Courage that I didn't have." Emilio looked at him then, and in that exchange of glances, Julian understood that this boy was not just a witness, he was a silent hero, someone who had carried an uncomfortable truth and risked everything to save Isabella. In the days that followed, Isabella insisted that Emilio share more activities with her, from reading stories at night to planting flowers in the garden. "I want these to grow strong like me," she said, burying a seed with her little hands. "And I'll make sure no one pulls them out," Emilio replied with a laugh. Julian listened from a distance with a mixture of pride and gratitude. He no longer saw Emilio as the maid's son, but as a boy who had entered his daughter's life at just the right moment, like a brother that fate had given her. One rainy afternoon, as the raindrops pounded on the windows, Isabella and Emilio improvised a shadow theater with flashlights and paper puppets. Julian sat in an armchair watching them. Isabella narrated in an enthusiastic voice. "The prince saved the princess trapped in the tower, but the princess also learned to fight on her own," Emilio added, making Isabella laugh. The story always ended with both characters escaping together. Julian realized that deep down they weren't talking about a made-up story. They were telling the story they had lived. That night, when the children fell asleep, Julian went into Isabella's room and found them both asleep on the same bed, surrounded by books and dolls. Isabella was hugging a blanket, while Emilio, on the other side, had a peaceful smile on his face. Julian stood there watching them for a moment, then leaned over, tucked the blankets around their bodies, and whispered in a broken voice, "Thank you for saving the most important thing in my life." Dawn brought a lighter atmosphere to the mansion. Isabella ate toast and fruit for breakfast, smiling every time Emilio made a funny comment to cheer her up. Julian, sitting across from them, quietly enjoyed the scene. But that calm did not last long. The doorbell rang, and minutes later one of the employees entered the dining room with a newspaper in his hand. "Mr. Herrera, you might want to see this." Julian took the newspaper and unfolded it. The front page made his blood run cold. The wife of tycoon Julian Herrera, victim of slander and betrayal, an unjust punishment. Below was a photograph of Veronica, smiling and elegant, taken at a social event months earlier. The article described Veronica as a devoted and loving woman who had been accused without solid evidence by a husband obsessed with protecting his fortune. It even suggested that she was the real victim, a misunderstood woman who only wanted to take care of her husband's daughter. Julian clutched the paper tightly. "This is sensationalist garbage," he muttered under his breath. The following hours confirmed that this was not an isolated case. The news, entertainment programs, and even social media were flooded with similar headlines. Who is Veronica Lopez really? The controversy behind the arrest, abuse, or persecution. The blacksmith's daughter. Symptoms of illness or parental manipulation. Every screen seemed to spew doubts, insinuations, and theories that sought to muddy the truth. Isabella, although shielded from much of it, managed to hear comments on television. "They say she wasn't mean to me," she whispered one afternoon, her voice trembling. Julian hugged her immediately. "Don't listen to those lies, my love. You know what happened. I know too." But inside, he felt rage burning in his veins. That same night, Ricardo Mendez, the trusted lawyer, arrived at the mansion with several press clippings under his arm. "I knew this would happen," he said, leaving the papers on the table. "Veronica has contacts. She's using public opinion as her weapon." "And what can we do?" asked Julian. "Confront her with facts. The clearer Isabella's medical condition becomes, the less room they'll have to invent stories. But I must warn you, the legal battle isn't always fought in court. It's also fought on the streets, on television, in what people want to believe." Julian listened silently, clenching his teeth. He was not a man accustomed to losing control of the narrative, and yet now they were painting him as a tyrant who was ruining the life of an innocent woman. The last straw came a few days later when a television program aired an interview recorded in prison. Veronica, dressed in simple clothes and looking haggard, spoke through tears. "Everything I did was for love," she said, looking directly at the camera. "Isabella is like my own daughter. I would never hurt her, but now they have turned me into a monster." The host nodded sympathetically, reinforcing the idea that Veronica was a victim of persecution. In the mansion, Isabella stared at the screen with wide eyes, confused. "Dad, what if she's right?" Julian turned off the TV immediately. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "No, daughter, don't be fooled. She wants you to doubt, but you know the truth. I was blind before, but not anymore. No one else will hurt you." Isabella nodded, though still with tears in her eyes. Determined to face the situation, Julian called a press conference in the mansion's garden. The press crowded in with cameras and microphones, eager to hear the other side of the story. When he came out accompanied by Ricardo and Dr. Torres, the murmuring died down. "Today I am not speaking as a businessman," Julian said in a firm voice. "Today I speak as a father." He recounted what had happened without embellishment or euphemisms. He spoke of Isabella's clinical condition, the medical diagnoses, the evidence gathered. "My daughter was a victim of abuse within her own home," he declared, his voice breaking at the end. "By trusting the wrong person, I allowed it to happen. That is something I will never forgive myself for." The silence was absolute. Even the reporters, accustomed to sensationalism, were disarmed by the harshness of his words. The images ran on the news. Julian crying, holding Isabella's hand, while Emilio stood by his side like a silent shield. Social media lit up. Where doubts had once abounded, messages of support now appeared. "That man accepted his mistake. That takes courage. The girl has the eyes of someone who has suffered. She doesn't lie. The real hero is the boy who spoke up when no one was listening." The narrative began to change. Veronica's shadow was still there, but little by little, the light of truth was making its way through. That night, when calm returned to the mansion, Julian sat down next to Isabella's bed. She slept peacefully with Emilio in the chair nearby. He looked at her for a long time with a mixture of relief and pain. "No one will silence us again," he whispered. "Not you, not me, not him." Veronica's shadow still hung over them, but for the first time, Julian felt that they were not alone in the fight. For years, Julian Herrera's routine had been marked by contracts, trips, and endless meetings. His life revolved around multi-million-dollar deals, while the mansion was reduced to a stage where he rarely stopped to breathe. Now everything had changed. Days began with breakfast at the main table, not with international conference calls. Instead of rushing out with his briefcase under his arm, Julian would sit next to Isabella, watching her finish her glass of milk, or laugh with Emilio as they told stories. The mansion, once filled with heavy silences and curt orders, began to fill with laughter, voices, and the aroma of shared meals. Julian had reduced his hours at the office. His partners, surprised, received the news with skepticism. "Herrera is cutting back on work," some commented. But he was clear about it. "Money can wait. My daughter cannot." It was a phrase he repeated shamelessly, as a constant reminder of his new priorities. Emilio's mother, Teresa, also saw her role transform. She was no longer just the domestic worker who worked under pressure and fear, but a reliable presence in Isabella's life. One afternoon, Julian found her helping the girl bake a cake in the kitchen. Isabella had flour on her nose and was laughing as Teresa showed her how to knead the dough. "I've never seen her so happy in the kitchen," Julian said, moved. Teresa smiled humbly. "Children need to feel like they're part of something, that what they do matters." Julian nodded. In those simple words, he found a truth he had previously ignored. Family wasn't built with luxuries, but with small, everyday gestures. The bond between Isabella and Emilio grew as if they had always been siblings. They played in the garden. They built cardboard houses in the living room and invented secret codes to communicate. One night, Isabella ran to Julian with a drawing in her hand. "Look, Dad, this is our new home." The paper showed the mansion, but it was no longer a coal building. It had colorful windows, smoke coming out of the chimney, and four figures holding hands at the door. Isabella, Julian, Emilio, and Teresa. Julian's heart melted when he saw it. "It's perfect, my love," he replied, kissing her forehead. The transformations were visible, even in the decor. Julian had the closed wings of the house opened. He allowed the walls to be filled with the children's drawings and the rooms previously reserved for business visitors to be turned into playrooms and reading rooms. Where there had once been silence, now there was music. Where there had once been distance, now there were hugs. One rainy afternoon, Julian sat with Teresa in the living room while the children played at building a tower of cushions. "I don't know how to thank you," he said sincerely. "You and Emilio saved what I couldn't protect." Teresa looked at him seriously but also kindly. "It's not a matter of gratitude, Mr. Herrera. It's a matter of learning. You're doing it, and believe me," Isabella notices. Julian sighed as he looked at the children. "I don't want to go back to being the man I was." "Then don't," Teresa replied with quiet firmness. That night, when the children were asleep, Julian walked through the mansion. He passed through the dining room, the kitchen, the brightly lit hallways. Everything seemed different, even though nothing had changed within the walls. He stopped on the main staircase and listened to the echo of laughter that, for the first time in years, resonated in every corner. The mansion, once a place of appearances, had become a real home. Julian knew it at that moment. The reorganization had not been just a matter of schedules or tasks. It was a reorganization of the heart. Autumn had arrived in the city with fresh air and golden leaves covering the mansion's gardens. Julian had decided to organize an intimate dinner without business guests or protocols. Just them, Isabella, Emilio, Teresa, and him. The main dining room had been transformed. The lights were warm, not dazzling. The table was decorated with small candles and a centerpiece of dried flowers that gave off a soft scent. There was no excessive formality, just the intention to share. Isabella sat at the head of the table in a blue dress that highlighted the color of her eyes. Emilio sat next to her, nervous but happy. Teresa discreetly took a seat across from them, while Julian presided over the table, watching with a mixture of pride and emotion. The dishes were served: roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and fruit juice. The aroma filled the room, reminding everyone that after so much pain, the time had come to savor life again. Isabella picked up her fork with a smile. She ate slowly, enjoying every bite. Her cheeks had a healthier tone and her laughter flowed naturally. Suddenly she stopped, looked at Emilio, and without saying a word, cut a piece of meat and placed it on his plate. "Here, Emmy," she said in a clear voice, "I want to share with you." The boy looked at her in surprise. "But you have to eat everything, Asa. You need more." She shook her head firmly. "You were also with me when I had nothing. You gave me bread when I was starving. Now I want to give to you." Silence filled the table. Julian felt a lump in his throat. Teresa looked down, her eyes shining. Emilio moved, accepted the piece, and smiled shyly. "Thank you, Isa." "No, thank you," she replied. The scene seemed simple, but that gesture summed it all up. The girl who had been deprived of food was now offering it freely, as a symbol of gratitude and rebirth. Julian, deeply moved, raised his glass. To Isabella, he said with a trembling voice, "Because she has shown that true strength lies not in what you keep, but in what you share." The others raised their glasses. Isabel laughed proudly. "And also to Emilio," she added, "because he was my hero." The boy blushed and Teresa could not hold back her tears. The dinner continued with anecdotes, laughter, and memories. Isabella told stories from school. Emilio invented word games and Julian allowed himself to listen without thinking about contracts or business. There was a new warmth in the air, as if the very walls of the mansion had changed. What had once been a scene of manipulation and silence now resonated with genuine affection. At the end of the evening, Isabella once again offered Emilio a piece of bread. This time she did so with a mischievous smile. "Let's promise we'll never eat alone again," she said. Emilio nodded and Julian felt that his daughter's words were more than a wish. They were a pact for life. When the dishes were cleared away, Julian stared at the three of them with tears in his eyes. He knew that this dinner would remain in his memory, not because of the food or the decorations, but because of that simple gesture that had changed everything. By sharing her plate, Isabella had not only shown her gratitude, she had sealed the union between two worlds, that of opulence and that of humility, now united by a bond stronger than any fortune. That night, Julian understood that true wealth was not in his surname or his money, but in the love he had finally learned to protect. Evening fell on the mansion with a golden glow. The dining room, it was still warm from the family dinner. The candles burned slowly, and the murmur of the children continued to fill the air. Isabella and Emilio laughed as they gathered up the last drawings they had left on the table, their clear voices echoing with hope. Julian watched them in silence. Something stirred in his chest, a weight he had been carrying for months and which now sought release. His eyes moistened as he reviewed what had happened. Isabella's fragility, Veronica's deceit, Emilio's courage. He slowly got up, still holding his glass, and approached the children. "Come here," he said in a broken voice. Isabella and Emilio looked at each other in confusion, but approached without hesitation. Julian took them both in his arms, hugging them tightly. Tears fell without him trying to stop them. "If I had sent you away," he said in a broken voice, "if I had let you go, Isabella wouldn't be here." The children looked at him silently. Isabella rested her head on his shoulder, while Emilio, although uncomfortable at first, allowed himself to be enveloped in the embrace. "You saved me, Emilio," Julian continued. "You saved my daughter, and you saved me too." The boy looked down, but his shy smile gave him away. Teresa, who was watching the scene from a corner, tried to hold back her tears. She had learned to live with distance, to occupy her place without crossing the invisible line between family and service. Now she saw her son embraced by the most powerful man she knew and understood that something profound was changing. Julian turned to her. "Teresa," he said solemnly, "come." She hesitated in surprise. "Sir, I can't, sir," she interrupted firmly. "Come, sit with us here," he said, pointing to the main chair next to Isabella. Silence filled the dining room. Teresa looked at her son, who nodded enthusiastically, and then at Isabella, who smiled and held out her hand. Finally, with hesitant steps, she approached and sat down. That simple, powerful gesture broke years of social distance. The table, which had once been a symbol of hierarchy, was transformed into a circle of affection. Julian took a deep breath as if he had finally broken down the last barrier. "Today, I understand something that took me too long to see," he said, looking at everyone. "It is not the walls or the riches that sustain this house. It is the people who are here." "You," Isabella listened with shining eyes. Emilio proudly lifted his chin. Teresa nodded silently, tears in her eyes. The evening breeze blew in through the open windows, gently moving the curtains. Outside, the garden was tinged with golden and reddish tones, as if nature itself were celebrating this rebirth. Julian hugged Isabella and Emilio again at the same time, pressing them against his chest. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you for saving the most important thing I had, even though I couldn't see it." In that moment, he understood that the truth was bitter because of the pain he had experienced, but also bright because of what had been born from it. A real family, united by gratitude, courage, and love. The mansion, once cold and marked by manipulation, now resounded with voices of hope. And as the children's laughter filled the dining room, Julian knew with certainty that he would never be blind again. Thank you for joining us until the end of this story. Remember to subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments what you think and where you are watching us from. Until next time, M.